Hi everyone, how are we doing? So now what I want to do is combine the labor market and output market graphs together. Now this looks a little overwhelming, but it's really not that bad. So I've drawn everything up here. So what you might want to do is stop it and reproduce this, but let me go through it and then you can decide how you want to handle it. So what we're having here is here is the labor demand schedule. What you want to focus on is this labor demand schedule and this labor supply schedule. So we're at point E, that's equilibrium. And we have an equilibrium wage rate W0 and a level of employment of Ln. Okay? Now, what we are going to do is divide employment into two parts. Ln, which is the natural level of employment, and then LC, which is the cyclical component of employment. And I'll explain that as we go on. And output is also divided into YN and YC, which we've discussed a little bit before. So I'm starting at point E here. That's long run equilibrium. And also, we're now at point E, right there in the output market. Here's aggregate demand schedule, short run aggregate supply schedule, long run aggregate supply schedule. So point E here and point E there represent the same idea. We're in long run equilibrium. And what that implies is the cyclical component of employment and the cyclical component of output both equal 0. So we're in long run equilibrium where LC is 0 and YC is 0. Okay? And what also we notice is the wage rate is W0. The price level is P0. So what we have in long run equilibrium is the real wage is W0 over P0. Okay? And then, as we talked about, this price level P0 is associated with some expected price level, which is PE, which is right there. Because as what we described in the previous video, is that a certain price level then provides information about what we expect prices to be doing in the future, which we describe as PE, the expected price level. So, just to summarize, we're at point E in the labor market, we're at point E in the output market, and they both represent the same idea. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to shift one of the curves by increasing the money supply. Okay, and we talked about increasing the money supply through open market operations. So we do open market purchase, that the Federal Reserve will purchase bonds back from the banks. The banks will switch those bonds and they'll get revenue or excess revenue and excess reserves in return, or just cash, and then they can loan out that money to firms and households. So we increase the money supply, which causes the aggregate demand schedule to shift from AD to AD prime. And again, that represents the idea that with banks having a greater amount of reserves available, firms and households can borrow the money, and that borrowed money is then spent on goods and services. And that reflects this aggregate demand curve shifting upward, and we now go to E prime. Okay? Now, E prime is short run equilibrium. Okay? Because we're no longer intersecting the three curves, we're at E prime, where we now have prices starting to rise and output starting to rise. Okay? At the same time, as the demand for goods and services is rising, what we assume is that firms have to borrow more, firms have to hire more workers. So as this curve is shifting outward, LD shifts outward to LD prime, to imply that if you're producing more output, you got to hire more workers. So what we're saying now, employment rises from Ln to L1. Okay? And then we're at E prime here and E prime there, which represent the same idea. And so now we can define YC. Let me make this a little bit neater. YC equals YN to Y1. That distance is the cyclical component of output. Okay? It's actually a departure from the natural level of output. So output is growing above YN by this amount. And the same token in the employment market, employment's rising to L1. So now Ln to L1 is the cyclical component of employment. And that's what I have here. LC equals the distance Ln to L1. Okay? So, but now at E prime, what we suggest is that prices are typically more flexible than wages. So let me ask you people this. How often when you get a job does your wages increase? And your wages may increase once a year, once every 2 years. But how often do we see price changes? prices we see changing all the time. Gasoline prices change. There could be sales of clothes going on for sale, so prices could fall. What we see, and I think all of us would agree, we see prices much more flexible than wages. So, in this case, the increase in prices is much larger than the increase in wages. Because again, prices are more flexible. So, what we find is that W1 over P1, the real wage, at E prime has actually fallen. Because what we're arguing is that wages are rising, but prices are rising at a much faster rate. So we see that the real wage is going to decline from W0, P0 to W1 over P1. So where at E, we had a certain real wage, W0 over P0. Now at E prime, we have a lower real wage. So we do see output rising, employment rising, but the real wage for workers has definitely declined. Okay? And this is what we call short-run equilibrium. Now, I don't have that written up here, so I'll put that. E prime is short-run equilibrium. Okay? So, that's not the end of the story, because now at E prime, workers are worse off because they've seen that their wages have, the real wages have declined. But remember what we said about the labor supply schedule. It shifts because of perceptions and changes of expected prices. So, as workers see their wages rising, but prices rising at a faster rate, they see their real wage declining. So what they want in the long run, what we assume is that workers can renegotiate for higher wages. So what we're saying in the long run, wage contracts can be renegotiated. And what these workers want is, look, I've seen prices rising faster than wages, so I'm worse off. So what I'd like is higher wage rate. So what that does, as we described in the previous video, this labor supply schedule is going to shift to LS prime, which is now a function, which I forgot to put there, PE prime, because the expected price level is risen. Expected price level is going up. And we see here that PE prime is greater than PE. So, what they want is, workers want higher wages, so this labor supply schedule shifts upward and inward, and what happens is, the wage rate rises to W2, all these workers get laid off. Okay? As they get laid off, as the cost of productions are rising, because wages are starting to rise, cost of productions for firms start to rise. As the cost of productions for firms start to rise, this short-run aggregate supply schedule shifts to LS prime. Oh, sorry, in this case, short-run aggregate supply schedule. Sorry about that. We'll put down short-run aggregate supply schedule. That shifts upward and inward. The reason why is that because workers demanded higher wages, cost of productions for firms go up, and as cost of productions increase, this supply curve, just like all supply curves, shifts upward and inward to E double prime right there. So, what we have now is that where output rose above the natural level of output, in the long run, output goes back to where they started with, at YN. But we see prices have increased to P2. And what we argue is that, and I'm running out of room on the board, so I'm going to put it down here, W2 over P2 equals W0 over P0. What this suggests is that when you increase the money supply, there will be a temporary increase in output from YN to Y1, and also at the same time, a temporary increase in employment. However though, in the long run, when workers demand high wages because they're worse off at E prime because real wages have fallen to W1 over P1, they renegotiate their wage contracts, demand higher wages, so the supply curve shifts upward and inward. Now, some people lose their jobs, but we go back to the natural level of employment and also the natural level of output, and in the long run, workers are no better off or worse off. Their real wages remain the same in the long run. But what we're arguing here is that in the short run, an increase in the money supply can temporarily increase employment and temporarily increase output. But in the long run, what we argue is money is neutral, meaning that in the long run, output does not change and employment doesn't change. In the short run, there are gains. But in the long run, a change in money supply has no permanent impact on output. So, what we're going to be arguing is that the Federal Reserve can use monetary policy to effectuate temporary changes in output and employment, but in the long run, it doesn't have an impact. But these short run impacts can be important. So, what I'd like you to do is, you may have to watch this video a couple of times, but this is the whole story. And I've mapped it out all in one graph. So what you might want to do is, as you watch this video a second time, is to, on a blank sheet of paper, is start to draw the graphs, and then add a graph as we change the money supply. So let me stop here, and we'll pick it up with the next video. Okay, so long.